So a very warm welcome to today's conversation. The conversation today is on ecosystems untangled, and we're going to be exploring how we can understand and manage complexity in ecosystems, and also think about the role of technology and helping us with these unentanglements. So my name's Gordon Blair. I'm a senior fellow in digital technology and living with environmental change, and that has allowed me to create the Ensemble project, which is looking at some of these themes and many others. And the Ensemble project is also the host of this festival. We're running a festival over the entire week. So I guess the first thing to say to you is, if you enjoy this event, have a look at what else we're putting on. I think Will's going to paste the URL for the Ensemble website and Untangled Festival in a second. Have a look and hope to see you at some of the other events. Many of the events are online, so it's very easy for you to join. So, a couple of things about how we're going to run the session today. It's going to be run in a kind of chat show format. So I'm going to help people want gradually, but actively, and have a richer conversation as we go on. So I guess I've always wanted to be a Graham Norton rather than an academic, and today is my chance to try that. So we're going to have one speaker at a time. We've got a fantastic set of speakers, and I'll introduce them as they come up. We want this session to be very much interactive. So I strongly encourage you to use the chat if you have a question you would like to ask. My assistant, Will, is going to be monitoring the chat and will draw it to my attention if there's questions there. And we're going to kind of pause for questions after each panel member. And also when we open it out, I'll indicate at various points. Just keep the chat flowing though, and we'll manage that, and we'll manage to interact with me. So as I said, today we're thinking about ecosystems, which are increasingly important in environmental science, ecosystems in all their complexity, how we manage that complexity, what is the role of digital technology in managing that complexity, and asking questions about the opportunities we might have about increasing sources of data, things like data science, new ways of presenting information, and also including right the way up to using arts to communicate, which is one of the themes of the festival. So I'm really looking forward to it. It's very much your slot, so ask the questions you want to, and we'll try and answer them. Just a final announcement before we get going. We've tried to be very active in Twitter throughout this festival. If you want to post something, please do. Tweet away as we're going along. Please use the hashtag Untangled Festival. And also, if you use ampersand ensemble links, then we will retweet it to the people who have been following the festival. So we'll post these in the chat. So a very warm welcome to all our attendees. And I'm going to start by calling up Paula Harrison to the sofa, or what would be a sofa if we could do this physically. So Paula, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Gordon. Great to be here.
Yeah. So I'm going to be lazy. I'm not going to introduce you. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Could you say a little bit about yourself and your research interests you do in eco?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. So I'm Paula Harrison. I work at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, based at our site in Lancaster. In terms of my research interests, I guess my research is mainly motivated about being sort of applied and solutions focused. particularly looking towards sort of whole system solutions, towards some of the really big grand environmental challenges that we face. So climate change, biodiversity loss, how to move towards a more sustainable future. And because they're pretty big and complex challenges, the sort of approaches that I work with have to, by their nature, involve a range of ecosystems, a range of sectors, a range of disciplines, and how we integrate the knowledge from all of that together and from a whole variety of different sources. So I suspect mostly I work more on sort of landscapes, and I think landscapes are quite typical of a complex system because they exist of lots of different things. You might have a bit of agriculture, a bit of river course, a forest, lots of interesting nature and biodiversity. So it's looking at collectively how all those different systems are interdependent on each other, but also what drives those systems and the system change. So not just biophysical drivers, sort of like climate and pollution, but also human drivers. How does the human system interact with that biophysical system?
Yeah, that's really interesting. We kind of have a rather eclectic panel here today, and people have come from many different directions. What's your disciplinary background?
It's yeah, I always struggle with that question. More previously, but now now interdisciplinary research is really taking off, and I think from an early age I didn't want to focus on a single discipline. So my degrees cover geography, statistics, operational research, and environmental science. So even my first degree was a joint degree in geography and statistics because I didn't want to focus on one topic. And I think that's typical of my background, because of my background, then I used all of that interdisciplinary knowledge to become a modeler, but not just a single issue modeler. I started off in the agricultural sector, looking at sort of crops and the agricultural system, then moved to look at nature and species and biodiversity, then realized actually there were a lot of interactions between nature and the agricultural system. So started to look at some of those interdependencies, but then also really started to look at human systems as well, and population change, population dynamics, urban development, and how landscapes are formed through this independence almost between supply and demand. Hence, I then ended up working quite a lot on ecosystem services, because they are the services that you get from ecosystems that provide benefit to people. So it depends really on what society demands from ecosystems, whether that's just food, whether it's regulating floods, whether it's regulating erosion. Then we can sort of look at the sort of composition and the natural capital of biodiversity that underpins the delivery of those services to humans. And then those interdependencies then are not just across the landscape, but they're also across different scales, because your service might be delivered in a different place to where it's demanded. So there's all these also cross scale as well as cross sector interdependencies. So complexities gradually built up over time. And yeah, it's exciting to try and drill into some of that complexity and capture it using different approaches.
Yeah, the image that came to mind when you were talking, I'm thinking of a one-man or a one-woman band. It seems to me that you're kind of almost a cross-disciplinary collaboration all in one person. How do you manage all the different influences from your past and from your training?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's why you often describe yourself as a jack of all trades, master of none, because you either deep dive into something single and you know extremely well, or you spread yourself across and you're a kind of linkage person. So I would sort of see myself as a linkage person, and certainly as my careers progressed, I find myself more coordinating interdisciplinary teams. So what I find enjoyable is bringing lots of people together from different disciplines and backgrounds, getting them to communicate clearly with each other. And a lot of that is done through modeling. So instead of agricultural modelers working on their own, hydrological modelers working on their own, biodiversity modeling workers on their own, I try and bring them all together into a team to put them to look at the linkages between the models and the interdependencies of the models within an individual system. But also we do that in participatory ways. So we don't just do it as a group of scientists, even though it's a very varied group of scientists. We will try and bring stakeholders and work very much in partnership with either the policy community, if that's what we're trying to inform, or occasionally also with more societal members, and so depending on what the purpose of the model and the integration is for.
Yeah, thanks for that. Having worked with you, though, I would disagree with that statement, master of none. And it seems to me that these kind of linkage people and coordination will understand maybe whole systems and how they interact are so important in today's environmental science. Just listening to you, the complexity of the challenge you're taking on board, you know, it's quite incredible. You're not working in an easy area. What motivates you to work in this area?
I think it's just the motivation is that so the challenge in part is the motivation, but it's also that we so desperately need solutions that take account of the complexity and don't ignore it. So for many decades we've had solutions that have almost been quite siloed, and that's incredibly frustrating. And we've addressed challenges in individual silos. And I mean, I've been involved in some of the intergovernmental partnerships around biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also around climate change. And I find it quite incredible that they're only really starting to cross-fertilize and work together. And there's just a massive need really for us to stop looking at things in individual sectors or silos, and to start understanding that if we do that, there are going to be some major unintended consequences. And I think we've probably seen that happening in any case, that with some of the policies that have developed in the past. So I just think there is a massive need there, and I don't think anyone's going to understand the whole system, but we can start to really join things together and get a much better understanding of sort of whether you call that win-win solutions or synergies, but at least if you have to make trade-offs, that there is a deliberation about them and an acceptance of this is a trade-off that we have to make to be able to meet this solution that we're all trying to get to. Yeah,
it's kind of curious. We kind of all know this. We all know we need this new kind of thinking, but it's not necessarily yet happening. But I'm going to park that and come back to that later when we get more people together, because I think that's a really important issue. So what tools do you have in your tool bag to manage this complexity? How do you go about it?
Well, I guess what I mostly work on is developing these integrated modeling platforms. And again, that doesn't really mean that we all sit in a darkened room as a bunch of modelers pressing buttons and making our models magically work together. There is a massive process besides first understanding what those interactions are in almost just conceptually before you can even capture them in models. But then ultimately, when you are trying to link together to the models, they're through sort of flows of data that represent some of those interactions and interdependencies. But it's not just the modeling platform. It's about understanding the current interdependencies, but then actually I work very much in terms of looking forwards, so very much forward projections, and in very much an exploratory way. So developing systems that you can ask what if questions to. So what if climate change is more extreme? So if we're at the high end of +4 degrees, what would be the consequences? Or what if that +4 degrees happened also with a 20% increase in population, who were demanding this and had diets of that? So it's bringing together all that whole range of different drivers on the system, and having a system that captures some of those interdependencies, and then looking in an exploratory way at what might happen going forwards. So it's accepting that there isn't one solution, but it's looking at that space, that exploratory space, and which potential solutions give the system more resilience or or which decisions are more robust to the uncertainty around what we know about the future and what we don't know about the future.
Yeah. So I guess you're building very much on the legacy in environmental science around environmental modelling and a lot of the very sophisticated models that exist and thinking about coupling them together. The new kid in the block is very much the unprecedented amounts of data we now have at our disposal. And I know we both work in SEED's, Centre for Excellence in Environmental Data Science, and what data science can do for us. I mean, how do you think that's going to change your day job going forward?
Yeah, no, so lots and lots of discussions in this space. It's exciting, but yeah, almost mind-blowing, I think, with the amount of data that's exploding. And I think there is a huge opportunity and a huge potential, but also a real need to upskill to know how quickly to make use of the data that's out there. And how to integrate it with models. So whether you're integrating it with models in real time, or at least providing data that where there's big data gaps, because modelers always moan about not having enough data to either calibrate their models, to actually properly understand processes, and there's always going to be gaps in knowledge of process understanding that need to be filled by more data-driven techniques. So I think that big challenge is how we analyze and process that data and couple it together with some of the modeling frameworks that we've got. So I think there's lots of interesting ways forward of taking both different data analytical methods through statistics, machine learning, and other techniques like that, but also combining it with a whole range of different modeling techniques, whether they're more empirical, statistical, data-driven, process-based, agent-based modelings. I think they all, depending on the problem you're trying to get to, they all bring different elements to it. And I think it's just, again, working out what might be the useful approach going forwards, because it's not always a one-size-fits-all. And certainly we know when we couple models together, you wouldn't necessarily do it in the same way or with the same set of models, depending on the challenge that you're trying to face. I would probably say one of the other areas is on scale, both spatial and temporal scale, and we get that a lot with both data and the models, because all of the data comes from different locations. Some of it's site-based, some of it's area-based, some of it's at different resolutions, much coarser than others. And often those spatial scales and resolutions don't match, so we need techniques for either upscaling or downscaling to make them match, to make them meet a reasonable spatial scale or resolution that is needed by the end user of the data or modeling platform that you're creating. But also, again, in terms of capturing temporal dynamics and extremes, are they important to the problem that you're looking at? And again, I think this is an area where data science can really help us in terms of delivering methods to the modelling groups that are working on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think this is just bringing home the complexity of the area you're working in, because you're looking at very complex systems. You're looking at complex systems across many different scales. You're looking at mismatches between scales and so on. So, it feels as if you need some extra tools in your toolbox just to manage this complexity.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm kind of curious as well. Sorry, I'll let you answer that.
I was just going to make the point that often in the past, we put a boundary around the end of our models, and we just say, well, anything outside of this, we're ignoring. It's outside the boundary of our modeling system, but that's an extremely artificial way of dealing with it. And we know that you basically are just parameterizing the outside of your boundary to get rid of the problem. And we know actually, again, with the types of challenges we're dealing with, displacement effects become more and more critical, because there's no point in us solving some of the big environmental challenges just in one region or within the UK, if by solving it, we're just displacing the problem to another part of the world. So it's part of complexity. It's becoming harder and harder to ignore. And I think we need to be able to have ways of either matching across scales or nesting models and data within each other to address some of these issues.
Yeah. So another area I know that you work on is emulation, and often using quite advanced machine learning techniques, maybe in the future, to emulation. Do you think that's going to be useful to you in analysing complex systems and their interactions going forward?
I think it certainly has a role to play, because again, with some of these data sets are so huge that you're going to have to find some methods like machine learning to try and see what patterns are in those data, and to try and then I think it's working out how we interpret the meaning behind some of those methods to be able to bring them into some of the modeling frameworks that I work on. So it's finding out how they complement each other, and where they can best be used together. And I'm sure with bringing all of these different methods together, it's also bearing in mind how much more of the complexity we're capturing, but also how much potentially more uncertainty we're bringing in to the equation, because the more complex we get, often the more the uncertainty explodes. And it's trying to capture that balance between when is it better to become more complex versus simplifying through assumptions, and that again often depends on the decision and that is trying to be informed through your research problem, your research analysis.
Yeah. So just a 2-minute warning to the audience. I'm going to ask for any questions, so make sure you post them in the chat. But if this was a proper chat show and we were meeting live and with a bigger budget, as you walked onto the stage, we would have a band playing your theme tune. We don't have, but very important question, what would your theme tune be and why?
So this is really a really difficult question, mainly because I really love music. So there's probably loads of answers, too many that I could give you. And so I am going to be cheeky and almost give you two answers. So the first, if I was being very literal about a single song and it was based on the title of the song, it would probably be Connections by Elastica, which I also really like that song. But actually, if you had a really, really big budget and you were actually flying a band in for me, it would be Nightwish from Finland, who just last year released an album called Human to Nature. And that in it is amazing. It's a very complex musical style, which brings together sort of orchestral music with heavy metal. And it has a whole CD just on the human system and one on the natural system. And the interplay and complexity in both musical style and subject would be perfect, but I think it would definitely blow your budget.
It would be a pleasure. So I thought I had a good knowledge of music, but that's a band and a piece of music I didn't know about. So maybe others in the audience, so please paste a link into the chat.
I will.
We can all follow that up.
Yeah.
So there are some questions for Paula. So Will, do you want to summarize the questions so far?
Yeah, so Grant Campbell asks, how closely do you feel scientists now have to follow things like sustainable development goals to help drive and influence the research?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think in my mind the sustainable development goals are really helpful, I think, because they're almost a bit like a complex system in themselves, because they're quite comprehensive and holistic in the way they've been developed, in that they bring in elements of both the natural and the human system, and to be able to address them collectively, you can't ignore interdependencies. So in my mind, I think they're great for underpinning, looking at other big policies such as climate change, if you're looking at the Paris Agreement, or there's the new biodiversity framework. all of them can almost be nested within the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think it is a great framework that can drive research, and it almost provides sort of that end vision of collectively what should we be trying to meet by whatever actions that we need to do in ecosystems and in human systems.
Okay, thank you. Kat has a couple of
Perhaps
questions.
one more, Will.
Yeah. So let's just see some of the same. Kat would like an example of the ecosystem modeling approach in a practical way. Is there any big projects you've used that approach with?
Yeah, so maybe I can talk about one that's kind of very relevant at the minute, where we're developing a modelling platform for the Welsh Government, and it's a business critical modelling platform, so we have to be very rigorous with how we deal with uncertainty and quality assurance and of everything of that modelling platform, because it's helping them actually design policy from the ground to replace the European policies that they had on the environment and on the agriculture. So it will basically be looking at what are the benefits to different ecosystem services and public goods from different interventions on land and elsewhere, and how does that those benefits, how do they play against the costs that it would be to Welsh Government to pay landowners to implement those interventions. So to do that, we have to have a whole range of models covering agriculture and forestry and land allocation and biodiversity and water quality and air quality. But bringing them together, we start to see some of those interactions, and we can provide information to Welsh Government that they didn't have before. They weren't able to be able to cross their policy areas in the way that they can now with this new platform.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot. Paula, would you be able to, there's a few more questions, so if you're happy to answer in the chat during the rest of the event, that would be, I think Gordon wants to move on now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Paula. So I'm going to move on to our second guest. Our second guest is Ian Hallman from Cranfield University. So if we can invite Ian to join us on the stage, so to speak. So welcome, Ian. So as with Paula, I wonder if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do in the context of ecosystems.
Yes, so as you said, Gordon, I'm Ian Hallman from the Cranfield Water Science Institute at Cranfield University, as you can tell from the great big virtual background behind me. In some ways, my interests are similar to Paula's. So I'm really interested in understanding how drivers of change, both the climate and the socioeconomic, affect our use of and management of land and water, going right from sort of field farm scale up to continental scale, and then the implications of those for natural capital and ecosystem services, and then leading into the sort of design and testing of solutions to address those impacts.
Yeah, and what's your background? What's your pathway? Is it similar to Paula's or very different?
Yeah, so slightly stole what I was going to say in a sense. So my background is as an environmental scientist, and I definitely see myself as a jack of all trades, master of none. But having done a sort of a generalist environmental science degree, I did a sort of classic hydrogeology PhD, looking at seawater intrusion into a coastal aquifer. And that was really interesting because the seawater intrusion was caused by land drainage, agricultural drainage. So it fundamentally had a human cause, as saline intrusion does. But it meant that hydrogeology had virtually no role in addressing the problem. Addressing the problem of saline intrusion in that system was really all about farming systems, availability of replacement land if you re-wetted the system. It was about cultural heritage. It was about community fears. So it was fundamentally a human sort of socio-ecological system problem. Then when I joined Cranfield, one of the first projects that I was involved in was sort of traipsing across the farms and fields of the Isle of Man, doing soil mapping to develop the first soil map of the Isle of Man. So really seeing at close hand, seeing, feeling, being in the land and seeing how it was managed and talking to farmers. So in a sense, from that generalist background, my motivation really is about trying to bring those real world perspectives into modeling to really produce better and more useful insights and therefore likely to be more successful solutions.
Yeah, so a really complex area you're working in. Other pathways in life. Yeah. Did you hear that, Ian? Yeah.
No, I didn't.
What's your motivation to work in such a complex area?
I think the motivation for me really is I'm not a modeler, but I use models, and it frustrates me greatly to see models being abused. One of my favorite models that I sometimes use, and it's favorite in inverted commas, is the soil water assessment tool model, SWOT model. Probably in catchment management, it's probably globally the most widely used model. It has a parameter that allows you to lose water across the boundary condition, across the model boundary. It's forever being used as a calibration parameter with no conceptual basis to it. So really the motivation for me is, is bringing useful complexity that's grounded in system understanding into models, rather than just using mathematical solutions to the problem.
Yeah, yeah. So I also know from the historic past, when we used to meet together in workshops, that used to, I think we appear together on a platform discussing different perspectives on model coupling. Now, what insights do you have into how we can better integrate different models together to construct something bigger and more complex?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that more complex is not necessarily better. So for me, even before we get to that model coupling, it's really identifying the elements of complexity that improve the system understanding and that you want to get into your model, rather than necessarily increasing the complexity. Early in my career, there was a lot of interest in lupins as the next big crop in agriculture, as a protein crop. Lots of effort went into developing crop models. You don't see lupins being grown because they completely, by focusing on the crop, they completely forgot the system. Mm-hmm. So in model coupling, a bit like Paul has said, really, it should be grounded in system understanding and deciding what is useful and not just going to create noise. Because I think one of the big challenges that we have in these coupled models is the sort of the propagation of uncertainty. And if we've got aspects of our complexity in there that we don't need, I don't think that's tremendously helpful. I mean, you mentioned model coupling. I mean, fundamentally, model coupling is straightforward. It's understanding what one model is providing when it's received by another model, so it can be used appropriately. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but fundamentally, to me, apart from the scale issues that Paula mentioned, it's about getting good communication, both the dialogue between the modelers, good model documentation, which is often not as good as we might hope, so that we can make that coupling as efficient, as effective as possible.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. In some level, it's quite straightforward and it's all about the communication. But it also strikes me that at times we focus on the models, yes, on the intents, the various feedbacks and complex interactions between models. And I wonder if we should be working harder to capture the entanglements in model coupling. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the sort of entanglements and the sort of interdependencies between models are something that we've definitely struggled with in some of the sort of integrated modeling platforms that I've led the development on, where it's relatively straightforward to get sort of one directional couplings in. But when you have sort of the interdependencies being bi-directional, so that there are feedbacks, I think that's where we've had one of the major challenges. And it sort of came back to sort of one of the questions that was raised to Paula about sort of complexity in integrated models and runtimes. That the more entangled the coupling and the models become, the longer the runtime becomes. So you risk being able to explore less with the models, and therefore you may end up with a less rich sort of exploratory understanding of the future space, because you've built in that additional complexity.
Yeah. So are there other aspects of digital technology enhanced to carry forward? Anything else exciting?
I think I caught what you said there, Gordon. I think one of the areas where I think it offers a lot of scope for helping us really is if I think about one of the integrated platforms that I developed, the integrated assessment platform, that contains something like a dozen coupled models, generating about 500 indicators or model outputs across 20,000 grid cells for a single run. And the ability to evaluate model performance and the realism of the interrelationships feeding through a system is doing it sort of with sort of normal tools is virtually impossible. So I think there's real scope for the sort of the digital technology tools to help us in improving model calibration and validation and evaluating the realism of model behaviors, because we know, model calibration validation is an imperfect process. And when we're doing the sort of future assessments, whether that be sort of climate change under a +4 degrees C world, like Paula mentioned, we know we're going outside of the range over which we've tested the model's behavior. And I think the opportunity for tools to really help us ensure that the behaviors of the models outside their calibration validation state plausible is a potentially powerful area.
Yep. So as previous, I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute. I see there's a very vibrant chat going on, and I'm glad I've got Will in the background to keep an eye on it because I'm losing track. So a couple of minutes, going to see if there's any questions, and I'll take one or two for you, Ian. But while people are thinking, what would your theme tune be and why? I'm curious to hear.
I feel really bad now because Paula had such a sort of intelligent musical idea. It sounded very sort of earnest and worthwhile. And mine, the one that immediately sprang to mind is Eric Idle's "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life," because as people that know me, they know that I always do. But if you look at the lyrics, I think the lyrics of the first verse are very apt around some of the sort of joys of research and science. So I'd go for that one.
I thought you were going to sing the first verse for a second, but I won't put you on the spot. So I'm going to turn to Will again. Will, any questions for Ian?
Hi, Ian. Yeah, there's just one at the moment, but I'm sure there'll be some more while we're talking. It's from Kat again, and she wonders, or they wonder, what were the lessons learned by communicating socio-ecological models to the general public or less technical stakeholders?
That's a nice question. I think implicit in that is the expectation that it's going to be difficult. And I think actually communicating these types of models to the general public, or those what are described as less technical stakeholder groups, in some ways is actually easier than communicating a sort of a complex disciplinary model, because the model is the sort of systems model is a better representation of how they perceive the world. You know, you talk to a farmer about a wheat model, they're not interested. If you talk to them about a model that is trying to explore the responses of their farming system and their farming business, with all of the complex interactions with prices, weather, soil conditions, water quality, they get that because that's the real world that they're operating in. So I think fundamentally the challenge is really just about language and communicating appropriately and effectively to the audience you're talking to.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ian. I wonder if I could invite Paula back up onto the stage. Hello again.
Hi there.
Yeah, just a warning to both of you. I'm going to go off piste because of the direction of the conversation. I'm not going to ask the question I was planning to, but it feels as if integrated modeling has cut across both things you're doing. So we're fast approaching Christmas, maybe not. What's in your Christmas list for something that will enhance your integrated modeling capabilities going forward? Yeah.
Ooh, well, I could say lots of funding would be good. Then we could do some sort of large-scale, long-term projects. That, I mean, in all seriousness, actually, the short-term funding for developing these kind of models is a problem, because as soon as you've got somewhere exciting, you've run out of funding and you've got to find some more to keep it going. But yeah, then again, it's finding ways forward for keeping those models to be flexible. Otherwise, they end up so inflexible and rigid that they're only useful for a limited range of applications. So so maybe it's a lot of funding for partnership working more than for a specific research project. So something that would widen the community and would bring in other disciplines and sectors. I would, in my mind, I guess it would be more the human side, I would say we're weak on, because particularly with some of the applications in the models, there are only certain responses that we can model well, some that we can model but not well, and others that we just don't have a chance of even representing them in the model. In terms of sort of particularly human decision making, human responses, how that interact with different institutional levels. There's lots and lots of stuff going on in the social sciences and in the quantitative social sciences that could really be brought into modeling frameworks in a much better way than it currently is. So maybe that's on my list.
Yeah, good answer. And you've also beautifully segued to our next panel member. So thank you for that. So Ian, what's in your Christmas list?
I'd absolutely endorse what Paula said, but I think I'd add an increased recognition from funders of the value of sort of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. You know, there is a trade-off in this type of work between sort of disciplinary depth and real world relevance and realism. And I think the balance there is often not appreciated by the funders. They prefer the detail, even if it's ignoring important interactions and complexities. I think the other thing that I would like to see, and I might be going off slightly off piste, but there's a real perception that coupled models have huge problems with error propagation. That as information passes between the models, the uncertainty multiplies. But actually, a lot of the much more complex sort of Earth systems models are in essence coupled models. It's just that the coupling is done internally and isn't seen. So I'd like that sort of appreciation of whether there is an issue with error propagation or uncertainty propagation in models to be slightly treated more fairly across the different ways of coupling modules or models.
Yeah, thanks for that. Interesting, you both referred to funding as a stumbling block, you know, the need for more long-term funding and the need for cross-disciplinary funding. But when you get scientists together, they always moan about funding, don't we? Anyway, there's a question. Will, do you want to read out the question from Grant? It's to both speakers.
Yeah, sure. So Grant asks, how important is previous expert knowledge and how can this be increased, adapted or maintained for future scientists and researchers whilst having the ability to use a range of models at their disposal?
I think, I mean, expert knowledge, or at least practical knowledge, for me is absolutely essential. That a model is mere, you know, when I think about my teaching, you know, a model is a simplified representation of a real system for a particular purpose. To know whether your model is an appropriate simplification, you've got to have some understanding of your real system. So I think there's an element of actually this starts with education, and it starts with the teaching and learning of the next generation, and making sure that that students working in the disciplines get practical insights either through what they do in their learning or through their projects, so that they generate their own understanding. So that would be the first thing I would say, is ensure that the coming generations get that practical experience and don't spend all of their learning in the classroom or looking at Zoom windows. Now let Paula carry on.
Yeah, okay, so I guess building on that, so yeah, I would agree. I guess it's also, again, the university makeup of still being quite siloed in disciplines, even though there is the attempt to sort of have courses that cross departments and disciplinary subjects. I think that could be done a lot more than it currently is now, and it links to what Ian was raising before about having funding for students, particularly when they get to masters and PhD levels that are specifically focused on interdisciplinary learning, and the application of that interdisciplinary learning. And yeah, and I think the more that you can have a placement somewhere within doing that, in terms of supporting what Ian was saying, really helps, because particularly as a modeler, if you're trying to develop a system, usually it's quite context dependent, so you don't know how transferable that is to a new circumstance, but you do need someone who knows that area really well, who has expertise in that area, to almost just sense check what you're doing, because otherwise it's very easy without that sense check to assume that because you're basing something on a process understanding that is actually still giving sensible results in a new area or a new location. So I think it is very similar to what Ian was saying. I think the real more promotion of that interdisciplinary knowledge, and maybe even more interdisciplinary journals or more accessible ways of getting that knowledge passed on to future generations of students.
Yeah, great questions from the audience, by the way, and two good answers there. So I'm going to give Ian and Paula a little bit of a break. And Paula mentioned the importance of social systems and humans, and inevitably economics. So that tees up nicely our next guest. So to invite Ece Özdemiroğlu up to the stage, and then we'll continue our conversation. So welcome, Ece.
Thank you, Gordon.
I have to say, I've been practicing rehearsing your name all week, and I just don't think it works with a Glasgow accent. So my apologies to you.
It does work. I'm married to a Glaswegian. He's very good. Scottish accent is very good with Turkish. That's where I'm from, and hence the name. But yeah, no, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So perhaps you could introduce yourself and say, what do you do in the world of economics? I know it's quite different from the first two speakers.
Yeah. Well, I'm an environmental economist, and I'm the founding director of FTech, which is Economics for the Environment Consultancy, and that's what we do is what our name says. We do economic analysis to make investment cases, policy cases for improving environmental quality, our human and economies in interaction with nature. I also have a couple of advisory jobs, personal positions with the UK Climate Change Committee, adaptation side of things, and most recently the Environmental Council for First Minister of Scotland. So I mentioned these because especially in these advisory meetings, but also in consultancy projects, you don't always have the time or the budget to delve into complexity as much as you would wish. So our main job is to spread our net as wide as possible, as deep as possible, and synthesize what we catch. Of course, we need to have, I think Paula was talking about QA. It is very important that you know where you're looking for, who you're talking to, so to cut lots of to get the best out of that search, we do partner with specialists in other fields a lot. Economists are not really specialists in anything. We just are specialists in framing particular problems in a particular way, asking awkward questions and pushing people who are experts to give us answers that they're not sometimes very comfortable with because it's too uncertain. But we have to keep the momentum going, and we don't have to answer all the questions at once. So what I'm really most interested in my generally work is that is to see whether economic and the way we run economy is really underlying lots of the environmental problems we're facing. Is there anything we can learn from the way the economy and people within it function that we can use to solve those environmental problems? A bit like creating a vaccine, really. Can economic analysis be a vaccine for environmental problems? I worked across many areas, particularly water supply, wastewater management, agriculture, forestry, and more last 5 years or so, adaptation to climate change across all these things. And of course, natural capital is a term that pops up a lot in my daily job. And it's just, I mean, we are talking about ecosystem services here. You might say, what's the difference? The difference is one of language. For some people, ecosystem services is too technical. They can't engage with it. But when you talk about capital to them, they understand that it's something that would keep on giving if only you looked after it. And when we talk to businesses, we say to them, look, you got accounts, financial accounts that tell you how your desks or machinery is depreciating. You depend on nature, you depend on water, land, soils, just as much, but you don't do that analysis. Why is that? They have no answer, but sometimes it's enough to ask the question to encourage people to engage with complexity than actually give them the answers. So that kind of thing, this is the kind of thing I do.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, well, I mean, like the other speakers, you're really embracing complexity and taking it on. What motivates you to work in such a difficult area in some ways?
Yeah, I think again, as Paula was saying, that the complexity itself is what motivates me. The kind of, keeps you young, keeps you fresh every time you approach a new problem. You learn something new. You learn a different way of communicating the complexity, just to get people to act. Because I think my main worry in what motivates me is to stop, to avoid inaction. Baby steps in the right direction. We may not know everything there is to know about something, but I believe that with all the data, all the expertise, all the evidence we have, we more or less know the direction of action. And sometimes people use complexity as an excuse not to do something, and that really kind of fires me up. Like, that is not a good enough excuse. But there are always trade-offs. And we mentioned that there are always choices. There are very few win-wins. If there were more, there have been in the past. In the future, we might be surprised. But if there were more win-wins, we would be doing better, I guess. So it's to acknowledge what motivates me is not to make the trade-offs for other people, but to give them as much information as I can in the best relevant way so they can make better trade-offs. They can be more accountable for the decisions they make. That kind of thing.
Yeah, so I guess part of what you're saying is sometimes we hide behind complexity, and that can lead to inaction. I mean, you've got real experience of working with people that matter, whether it's large organizations or government or local government. I mean, how do you go about communicating something that's really complex in order to make them active participants in the solution space?
Yeah, I think one element of that is actually having, whether the word is empathy or compassion, I don't know, but the people that you're advising. When you're, I find that when we are into a particular topic and its complexities, we're very keen on telling the other side everything we've done, everything that can be done, and all the evidence. And it's a bit one-way conversation. I'm telling them what should be done. Whereas I think if the conversation starts with saying what is your problem, what limitations there are for you to act on any solution, and then I try and slot in the evidence that I have into their map of the world, if you see what I mean. And I think that takes a lot of time to understand. It needs me to be on all the time, if you like. You have to keep observing people, but that's also where the fun is. And also when it's not when the whole picture is too complex, it's good to break it down. But Paul made the point about the example. Sorry, Ian. Ian, not Paul. Ian made the point about focusing on one crop and forgetting the whole system. I don't mean breaking things down in that way, but it is possible to keep the whole full picture, big picture, in smaller scales. Maybe do a case study, or maybe do a pilot of something, to ease people into what is more, what else is possible, and also learn other people's languages, because we might use the same words, but we may not mean the same thing by them. And sometimes if you don't acknowledge it at the beginning, you could spend months talking in cross purposes, which then puts all modeling effort at sort of sometimes, oh, that's not what we ask you to model. So it's not useful. So all those kind of things. And I think respect as well. We talked about multidisciplinary work. The way to deal with complexity is definitely a multidisciplinary approach in my world. And in some ways, actually, it's a much easier way of working in consultancy than it seems to be in academia. Because in consultancy, if you put together a multidisciplinary team for your client, that is valued very highly. Whereas I hear academic colleagues complaining about multidisciplinary papers don't find publication space in good journals. That really needs to be tackled by funders and publishers in academia in general. I mean, and also I think being a bit more entrepreneurial with the analysis, that might be my final comment. And perhaps an example of that is actually some work we did with CEH. I don't think Paula was involved, but Lawrence Jones was involved. We did some natural capital accounts for ONS and DEFRA, which had a lot of data on air quality and the ability of vegetation cover to absorb air pollution. And if we left it there, that data would have just sat in the natural capital account and no one would be able to access it. But we put our a bit of time and money, tiny amounts, and turned it into an online tool, so that you can click on a map in UK and it tells you the average benefit of avoided health impacts from vegetation cover absorbing PM 2.5. Now that's what the minimum you can do with that data, but it makes it easy for local authorities to click and use. It's called pollution removal by vegetation. We haven't been entrepreneurial enough to give it a good name, but it's there. We can also do lots of like very spatially location specific modeling with that, but it wasn't necessary for that. The data is there. If anybody is interested, we'll promote it and they might use it. But it's that kind of break it down to individual bite-sized chunks for people to handle, but to keep always, whet their appetite for more as well.
Yeah, I think if you were a computer scientist, you would come up with a rather cheesy acronym, which is not necessarily the way to go. So
yeah.
The other thing that's jumping into my mind is uncertainty, because you hear a lot in environmental science about uncertainty around data, around modeling, around the overall end-to-end analysis. I mean, you're talking to important people. How do you communicate this uncertainty? How do you portray it to decision makers?
I think transparency is very important. I think Ian was right when answering the question about how do you communicate this to the non-technical audiences. So we're all non-technical except for our little bits of work. And I think we need to, again, respect the audience and not simplify anything, not dumb it down, but actually find ways of making it relevant for them. One very easy way of doing economic analysis under uncertainty is to do scenario analysis. And I think Paula mentioned that as well, what ifs, or thing we called switching analysis. How wrong do I have to be in my assumptions, in my analysis, for the final recommendation I make to you to be wrong? So if I do that analysis and if I present it to you, then we can negotiate about the level of uncertainty we can live with. I mean, that's not always easy. I remember saying in a meeting to someone who was pushing me very hard to be more certain, as an excuse for no action, actually. I said to them, look, we can leave this meeting and get hit by a bus and die. Uncertain. Life is uncertain. You know, let's get a grip on this. We need to, we always need to learn to act under uncertainty. There's also personal responsibility for people like me who are, if you like, at the end of the funnel, that we're getting all the evidence and we need to give advice to someone. Sometimes I have to stick my neck out, even if the evidence is not 100% strong. I can't hide it. I don't hide it. That doesn't help anybody. But I am paid to make a recommendation, and I should earn what I'm paid. And sometimes I say to my colleagues who are specialists in areas, look, we need to make an assumption here. Do you want to make that assumption? Do you want me to make that assumption? I think it's better coming from you rather than me, because you are the expert. And I find that always works. So that's what I try to do. Also, actually related.
You kind of convinced me.
Sorry, the related to that is that we talked about, sorry, there's a bit of a delay in my line. We talked about kind of how to deal with the uncertainty around recommending to do something. Sometimes it's actually more certain what would happen if you didn't do anything. And we can't forget that. We can't forget the showing my client what would happen if they did nothing. Sometimes doing nothing is actually the better option. It's not always that we have to keep doing things, but it's keep both in mind. It's not a learning, it's sometimes a negotiation process to dealing with uncertainty.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you've kind of convinced me. If I want anyone portraying science to important decision makers, I want it to be you, because of your passion and your clarity.
Oh, thank you, very kind.
You've listened to the other two speakers who come, all three of you are really grappling with the complexity of ecosystems. You've heard the other two speakers speaking from very different perspectives in some ways. Is there anything that you've heard earlier that really resonated with your world, even though you're coming from a different direction?
Yeah. No, I did almost everything actually, and it was very good to see the modeling doesn't happen in darkened rooms. Actually, that's the phrase that I used many times before about how economists come up with the numbers that we come up with. That I think we're all trying to, as you say, grasp uncertainty and complexity, and not to simplify it, but to reflect it. So that was also very good. The working in multidisciplinary environments and enjoying and respecting that is also really encouraging to hear. And really, it's really encouraging to say that actually we've got all the, in some ways, humility to say we can't answer all the questions. We need to work together. It was really nice to hear the approach is not to conquer the complexity, is to learn to live with it and learn to keep going within it, and do that working together. And if we can achieve that amongst the people who produce research evidence, I think that would also catch on with the people who are supposed to use this evidence to make decisions for society or the business. So I'm really delighted to hear the conversation before me.
Yeah. And your training is as an economist. Do you think there's anything particular to that training that helps you in the world you're in now, or does it hinder?
No, it helps. it helps in this sort of sense that how I see the world, how this sort of pragmatic approach comes very much from the economics, I think. In about like keep asking the so what question, because I find myself as an economist not either expert in a particular ecosystem or ecosystem service or economic sector. I can go in and ask impassionate questions in a passionate way, if that makes sense. So, you know, why do you think this is a good thing to do? Why do you think this area is good, should be conserved? What are the impacts on other people, other groups, other species? So this questioning frame of mind always helps. But also what I studied in economics was models that were awfully simplified, lots of assumptions about human behavior, lots of linearity in reactions. And of course, when you look at nature, that is even more wrong. So the shortcoming of economics and sort of, you know, stepping back from economic models that are presented in this kind of like this wonderful models with lots of data, but actually they're based on some very simple, you know, clearly most of the time wrong assumptions. So can we actually use some of that evidence, some of that approach, but in a much more mindful and healthy way, and actually put some more realism into the models? And I think that helps me. I do like a cost benefit analysis.
Yeah. Good. So I'm keen to actually get the three of you together, because I think that's going to be fascinating. So I'm going to move towards my last question, and again invite the audience if they've got one or two questions for you. So as you know, the last question will be, you know, what would your theme tune be and why?
I won't sing it, but it might be too much information. It's the reason I chose it are two reasons. One is that it sort of picks me up when I feel a bit down about all this stuff, although I'm mostly an optimist. So I sing it on top of my lungs, but hopefully no one hears it. It's Nina Simone's "How It Feels to Be Free." And the second reason is one of the lyrics says, remove all the bars that keeps us apart, which I think is very important for us to do now. And that's why I like it. Makes me emotional as well.
Yeah, a wonderful song from a wonderful singer. So, Will, are there any questions that have come in for Etchi?
There's some comments. So if anyone's got any other questions, feel free to add them to the chat. So Lucy says it's great to hear about mobilizing the data in a way that's accessible for policy. And Bill totally agrees about talking in the same language between disciplines. Crucial as also is talking with stakeholders or members of the public as to what is important to them. So there's not been any questions yet, but if anyone, you know, if anything occurs to anybody, feel free to add it to the chat as we go along. And
sure.
Yeah, I'm actually going to move to the three together, because as I said, I wanted a good 15 minutes for that, and that's exactly what we've got. So if we can invite all our panelists back to the stage. Hello again. So I'm just going to start off with one of the things that's motivated this whole panel has been a phrase, systems thinking. You're taking a systems thinking approach. I use the phrase quite a lot, but I probably don't know what I mean by it. So I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about how we move towards this holy grail of a systems approach to managing this complexity. And if anybody can enlighten me as to what I mean when I use that phrase, that would be very helpful. So I don't know who wants to go first.
I can jump in there. Usually easier to go first, but we'll see. Well, I'm not sure I have the answer in any case, Gordon, but I can have perspective on it. And I think it's because you're talking your term has got the word thinking at it, and I think in my mind at least that's moving away from the siloed thinking. So it is in my mind about connections, or hence my song, and interdependencies and all of those kind of things. But depending on what your client or end user or your challenge is, what are the important connections or interdependencies will vary enormously. So whether they're across sectors, ecosystems, scales, about actions and decision makers, or about drivers. And so I don't think there is one system that addresses everything, or if there is, it would be so complex that it'd be almost impossible to try and put to actually utilize it to move towards a solution. So I think it's all context dependent, but I think it is a moving to more of a way of working and a way of thinking in partnership with the people who are defining the problem, or need to find the solution or the actions. And again, here, just building on what Etche was saying about working with your clients and building up that sort of honesty and the trust over the long term, I think that's really crucial. We've often found that your client might come to you with a problem, but actually 2 years in, they realize they've completely redefined the problem in another way because of the conversations you've had. So I think it is that two-way interaction that actually, on both sides, we don't always necessarily know how to define the problem, let alone the solution. And I think the whole systems thinking helps us have those conversations that otherwise we might not even be having at all.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I go back to the sort of the definition that I use of a model, that it's a simplified representation of a real system for a particular purpose. And to get that simplification, you've got to understand the system and what is important for the question you're trying to answer. And just as an example, it might not be a good example, but a statistic that fascinated me, having grown up in a farming community, that if you go to look at Japan, 75% of the people involved in farming, 75% are over 60 years of age. If you're trying to understand the future of agriculture or the effects of climate change on Japanese agriculture in the second half of this century, and you ignore the aging and the demographics of the farming population, you're going to get completely the wrong answer, because you've not thought about that system and what is important for your question.
Yeah,
that's very good.
Etche, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think just to add, actually, in terms of picking up on Ian's point on what's relevant for the decision, because the systems are so big and so related and complex. Where do you set the boundaries? And I think that's where lots of the discussion happens, isn't it? And where the decision maker thinks actually they're in the center of the system, when by the end you realize they're actually just like a tiny dot in the corner. And actually that realization is a good thing, because then you can show to them how dependent they are on everyone else. And then maybe the practical way of finding the boundaries is like, you keep asking them, how about this, but how about that? And, where do you get that input? Who's going to do that job? And then you kind of just sort of, rather than decision tree, maybe we're too hooked on decisions. We have question trees, that you go until you can answer. The last question you can answer is your boundary, and maybe that's too narrow and you want to expand it. And I think natural capital terminology is helping us with that. I mean, there's lots of issues with, you may not like the term and stuff, but actually lots of the economic agents had always focused on maximizing what they get out of nature. So whether it's crops, whether it's timber, whereas with this capital thing, we're saying to them, don't try and maximize these things individually, because you're not helping anyone and you're not helping yourself in the long term. Try and look at the stock of capital that we can all look after. That's the system. If we all look after the system, it's going to keep on giving to us all. And it's just making people realize that they have a stake in that system. It's not someone else's system to manage. They are managing it. They're just sometimes managing it awfully badly, and it's making an effect on everybody else. And that's why I like that concept and the question approach.
Yeah, yeah. With my research group in the last 6 months or so, with a reading group around Donella Meadows' wonderful book, Systems Thinking, a Primer. I don't know if any of you know that. And it all makes sense. You know, it's beautiful. It talks about complex systems and not drawing boundaries and respecting all the interactions and so on. And you go along going tick, 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 tick. But then it comes down to, okay, how does my practice change? And that's the bit that's more difficult to me. So I wonder if each of you have got an answer to me about, you know, what has to change to really embrace whole systems thinking and hence tackle complexity.
I'll start. And I think in some ways it's humility. It's the humility of realizing that other people and other disciplines have value to me. It's humility in realizing that my communication might not be as clear to another discipline, rather than thinking they're not making sense, they're not communicating. You know, it's not always the other discipline's fault. So for me, that's a key element of moving to a systems thinking, is that humility. And I think Etche mentioned empathy as well.
The humble academic, I love the concept. Anybody else like to pick up on that?
Maybe I totally agree with Ian. And one thing to add perhaps is the relevance, is to demonstrate that why is system thinking is relevant for someone. It's not, you know, just to leave that it's a better way of thinking is not enough. Like, what would they gain from thinking in a better way? And I remember this moment where I presented a natural capital account to an estate owner, farming estate owner, and it wasn't like in a fancy graphic, it wasn't in nice design, it was in a balance sheet format. He was very familiar on how to look at a balance sheet. Not all of us maybe, but he could follow the numbers with his finger, and I thought, okay, we're getting somewhere, because he was comfortable. And then he saw a number there and he said, and this was a public good that he doesn't currently provide, but he said, oh, I know someone who wants to finance this public good locally. So if I actually did this, it's about carbon capture and stuff, but if I actually changed some of my farming practices and I could store more soil in my carbon in my soils, maybe they'll pay for it. You know, instantly he was like, okay, you don't need to convince him about systems thinking, because it's his livelihood that could improve as a result. And at the same time, he's going to provide public good and solve someone else's problem. Isn't that fantastic? You know, and we'll see if the deal goes ahead, but at least that first step was taken. And he wouldn't have seen that if he only looked at what he's always done, which was producing food crops. So there are benefits when you make things relevant, I guess.
So I guess building on both Etche and Ian, maybe just trying to widen it out in terms of how can a systems thinking perspective help affect some of the change that we need in wider society to actually move towards a more sustainable future, because I think that is the major challenge. And I think actually everything that Ian and Etchy said also applies there. But it's about getting the conversation started often in many places, from the community level going up. And so some of the work that we've done, particularly in envisioning futures with stakeholders and societal stakeholders in particular, where you give people a space, an open space, to basically say what kind of future they want, what are their values, what are their desires for the future, how do they differ from the other people that they're working with in their community or elsewhere in the community. That can actually be really helpful, because then you start to build those connections up, and you actually start to also see how that future is or isn't different from today. So then what are the pathways that we need to take to get from today to that future? So you can start to look at the building blocks and the sort of the connections in the system that's relevant to get to the future that they want. And ideally you'd want some kind of shared vision, but you might not be able to get to that shared vision. But even going through the process shows you where particularly some of the barriers are, or where some really different ingrained values that are difficult to overcome are. And we need to start thinking about actually how do we overcome those barriers. And I know, Gordon, you were going to mention about art-based methods, and maybe H wants to talk a little bit more about this, but we've used some of those and in previous projects through sort of theatre and installations, and just taking photographs and making mosaics and things that will represent somebody's future vision. And I think that's really useful, because it really does sometimes helps get used to that emotional connection, allows people to be a bit more to self-examine their own values a little bit more and how they match other people's values for the future, and to look at the ways forwards. And I think my literally just over the summer holiday, my daughter, who's 19, came looking on my bookshelf in my home office for a book about environment, because she's obviously suddenly getting interested in environmental values. And the one she selected was the PhD thesis from an artist who'd worked with our project, and his thesis was called the Transformative Imagination. And it's really excellent about sort of how you have to embrace systems change and systems thinking through, and how art-based techniques can really help you to do that, to capture people's imagination and understand the need to change, not just in small little incremental steps, but the fact that we really do need big transformational change to get to the kind of future that most people want.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paula. That was the one topic I had left I wanted to explore, so I'm glad you brought that up. So I'm just going to finish with, Untangled has been about art, science, technology, and nature, and we've explored many of these. But Paula, as you said, I think arts is so important, and I know that Etch has got a passion here. So I just wonder if you could just add to what Paula said. What's the role of arts in communicating these complex areas? And
yeah, I think the key role for arts is one that we've possibly most underestimated, and that is helping us to look at the world in a different way. We tend to use art in sort of at the end of our research. Can that make it easier for us to communicate our evidence? No. Can they make it easier for us to set up our systems right at the beginning? And what is the problem? And show us. And in theatre, my passion is in theatre, and theatre is, they say, show, don't tell. And that's why arts are useful. And I'm also involved in a theatre charity, and I'm going to put a link in the chat for that. But they're doing a festival during COP. Good cop, bad cop. Let's see, talk about like, what does it mean? Not just, as I think Grant's comment as well, that documentary was good in saying, if things go like this, X might happen. Can we make it more personal and passionate? If you want X in life, how much more difficult or more costly it will become if you ignore climate change? It's the same evidence, but it's the sort of turning it on its head and starting with what people want now and first, and see then making climate change relevant for them. There's going to be a play exploring that, but we'll see how it's uncertain and complex.
Yeah, so we're out of time, sadly. I could have kept going all night, but I guess people want to go and get some food. Massive thank you to our three panelists. You've all been sensational, and I can see from the chat that the audience have really enjoyed it as well. Thank you to the audience, because the questioning has been great, and the really interesting chat, which we'll capture and keep. And also a big thank you to Will behind the scenes, who's kept everything moving slowly. So Will, I don't know if you want to appear on stage and I can say a thank you to you in person. And while Will's spotlighting himself, hi Will. The festival's ongoing. There is one more of these conversations, and it's about the role of arts and the kind of research we're doing. So I encourage you to have a look at that and join in as well, and also look at the rest of the festival sites. We're done. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. You've been an excellent host.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Better than Graham.
Thank you.
Thank you.